little bit about today's program. And Lois Evans is going to do the read. We asked people to choose the read that they'd like to do, and Lois chose this read. Lois is part of Penn's Village, and she's a very active volunteer, a member of our board. And Lois, correct me if I'm wrong, but your career is in nursing and administration in nursing. People can read as long as they want. I think this read is going to take us about 50 minutes or so. So if anybody would like to go get a glass of soda or something before we get started, you can do that. But when Lois said to me she's going to read from James Baldwin. And I think a lot of people know a little bit about James Baldwin, but I don't think a lot of people know a lot about him. And when she mentioned that she would do this read, I was one of the persons that knew a little bit about him, but not a lot about him. And one of the reasons that I knew about James Baldwin, because being a gay person, he made a significant contribution to gay liberation, as well as African-American liberation. So he's quite an intellectual man. For those of you that have never seen it, he did a debate with James Buckley in 1965 at Cambridge University. One of the two people got a standing ovation, which had never occurred before at the Cambridge Debating Club. And Mr. Baldwin was the man that got the standing ovation. So it is on YouTube, and if you've never seen it, it's quite enlightening and quite wonderful to see. So before Lois gets started, I'm going to read a little bit about James Baldwin. We could read for hours just on who he is and how much he did and how well he is respected. But I always like to give a little bit of background. He was born in 1924 and died in 1987 at the age of 63. He was an American novelist, playwright, essayist, poet, and activist. His essays, as collected in Notes of a Native Son, 1955, explore intricacies of racial, sexual, and class distinctions in Western society, most notably in regard to the mid-20th century United States. Some of Baldwin's essays are book length, including The Fire Next Time, 1963, No Name in the Street, 1972, and The Devil Finds Work, 1976. An unfinished manuscript, Remember This House, was expanded and adapted for cinema as the Academy Award nominated documentary film, I Am Not Your Negro, 2016. One of his novels, If Beale Street Could Talk, was adapted into an Academy Award-winning dramatic film of the same name in 2018, and it was directed by Barry Jenkins. Baldwin's novels, short stories, and plays fictionalize fundamental personal questions and dilemma amid complex social and psychological pressures. Themes of masculinity, sexuality, race, and class intertwine to create intricate narratives that run parallel with some of the major political movements towards social change in mid-20th century America, such as the Civil Rights Movement and the Gay Liberation Movement. As such, Baldwin's protagonists are often, but not exclusively, African American, while gay and bisexual men also frequently appear as protagonists in his literature. These characters often face internal and external obstacles in their search for social and self-acceptance. Such dynamics are prominent in Baldwin's second novel, Giovanni's Room, written in 1956, well before the gay liberation movement. And the LGBTQ bookstore in Philadelphia was named after Giovanni's room. So Lois, we're really pleased to have you and to have you chosen to read James Baldwin's work. And if you'll just introduce a little bit about yourself and the piece you're going to read.
Yeah.
There you go.
So when Mark spoke to me about doing a reading, he thought it would be useful to have another reading that related to the work we're doing in Penn's Village on inclusiveness and diversity, and since I'm on that committee. And I tried to think of what to do because there's so much out there right now. Everything is constantly coming across the screen of things to read and whatever, and my bookshelf is getting full of those books. But so I was talking to my daughter, who actually teaches an African American literature course or two in her university, and she said, "Why don't you read Notes of a Native Son, the essay? I think it will be good." So I hadn't read it for years, so I did read it, and it, to me, because it was coming to me at a time when all the unrest was happening after the murder of George Floyd, and the unrest in our city and many cities across the country, issues around the police, etc., that there were so many commonalities in this, and it was 77 years ago. So the concern was, have we changed? You know, what has happened in that time? But I also found that his narrative about it, I thought, provided some insights that might help us understand what is still going on today and how we might think about change. So that's why I'm reading this story, and I found it very moving myself each time I've read it. So I'll try to do it justice. I hope that you'll follow along. On the 29th of July in 1943, my father died. On the same day, a few hours later, his last child was born. Over a month before this, while all our energies were concentrated in waiting for these events, there had been in Detroit one of the bloodiest race riots in the century. A few hours after my father's funeral, while he lay in state in the undertaker's chapel, a race riot broke out in Harlem. On the morning of the 3rd of August, we drove my father to the graveyard through a wilderness of smashed plate glass. The day of my father's funeral had also been my 19th birthday. As we drove him to the graveyard, the spoils of injustice, anarchy, discontent, and hatred were all around us. It seemed to me that God himself had devised, to mark my father's end, the most sustained and brutally dissonant of codas. And it seemed to me, too, that the violence which rose all about us as my father left the world had been devised as a corrective for the pride of his eldest son. I had declined to believe in that apocalypse which had been central to my father's vision. Very well, life seemed to be saying, here is something that will certainly pass for an apocalypse until the real thing comes along. I had inclined to be contemptuous of my father for the conditions of his life, for the condition of our lives. When his life had ended, I began to wonder about that life, and also, in a new way, to be apprehensive about my own. I had not known my father very well. We had got on badly, partly because we shared in our different fashions the vice of public pride. When he was dead, I realized that I had hardly spoken to him. When he had been dead a long time, I began to wish I had. It seems to be typical of life in America, where opportunities, real and fancied, are thicker than anywhere else on the globe, that the second generation has no time to talk to the first. No one, including my father, seems to have known exactly how old he was, but his mother had been born during slavery. He was one of the first generation of free men. He, along with thousands of other Negroes, came north after 1919, and I was part of that generation which had never seen the landscape of what Negroes sometimes call the old country. He had been born in New Orleans and had been quite a young man there during the time that Louis Armstrong, a boy, was running errands for the dives and honky-tonks of what was always represented to me as one of the most wicked of cities. To this day, whenever I think of New Orleans, I also helplessly think of Sodom and Gomorrah. My father never mentioned Louis Armstrong except to forbid us to play his records, but there was a picture of him on our wall for a long time. One of my father's strong-willed female relatives had placed it there and forbade my father to take it down. He never did, but he eventually maneuvered her out of the house, and when, some years later, she was in trouble and near death, he refused to do anything to help her. He was, I think, very handsome. I gather this from photographs and from my own memories of him dressed in his Sunday best and on his way to preach a sermon somewhere when I was little. Handsome, proud, and ingrown like a toenail, somebody said. But he looked to me as I grew older like pictures I had seen of African tribal chieftains. He really should have been naked with war paint on and barbaric mementos standing among spears. He could be chilling in the pulpit and indescribably cruel in his personal life, and he was certainly the most bitter man I have ever met. Yet it must be said that there was something else in him, buried in him, which lent him his tremendous power and even a rather crushing charm. It had something to do with his blackness, I think. He was very black, with his blackness and his beauty, and with the fact that he knew that he was black but did not know that he was beautiful. He claimed to be proud of his blackness, but it had also been the cause of much humiliation, and it had fixed bleak boundaries to his life. He was not a young man when we were growing up, and he had already suffered many kinds of ruin. In his outrageously demanding and protective way, he loved his children who were black like him and menaced like him. And all these things sometimes showed in his face when he tried, never to my knowledge with any success, to establish contact with any of us. When he took one of his children on his knee to play, the child always became fretful and began to cry. When he tried to help one of us with our homework, the absolutely unabating tension which emanated from him caused our minds and our tongues to become paralyzed, so that he, scarcely knowing why, flew into a rage, and the child, not knowing why, was punished. If it ever entered his head to bring a surprise home for his children, it was, almost unfailingly, the wrong surprise. And even the big watermelons he often brought home on his back in the summertime led to the most appalling scenes. I do not remember in all those years that one of his children was ever glad to see him come home. From what I was able to gather of his early life, it seemed that this inability to establish contact with other people had always marked him and had been one of the things which had driven him out of New Orleans. There was something in him, therefore, groping and tentative, which was never expressed and which was buried with him. One saw it most clearly when he was facing new people and hoping to impress them, but he never did, not for long. We went from church to smaller and more improbable church. He found himself in less and less demand as a minister, and by the time he died, none of his friends had come to see him for a long time. He had lived and died an intolerable bitterness of spirit, and it frightened me as we drove him to the graveyard through those unquiet, ruined streets to see how powerful and overflowing this bitterness could be, and to realize that this bitterness now was mine. When he died, I had been away from home for a little over a year. In that year, I had had time to become aware of the meaning of all my father's bitter warnings, had discovered the secret of his proudly pursed lips and rigid carriage. I had discovered the weight of white people in the world. I saw that this had been for my ancestors and now would be for me an awful thing to live with, and that the bitterness which had helped to kill my father could also kill me. He had been ill a long time, in the mind, as we now realize, reliving instances of his fantastic intransigence in the new light of his affliction and endeavoring to feel a sorrow for him, which never quite came true. We had not known that he was being eaten up by paranoia, and the discovery that his cruelty, our bodies and our minds, had been one of the symptoms of his illness was not then enough to enable us to forgive him. The younger children felt, quite simply, relief that he would not be coming home anymore. My mother's observation that it was he, after all, who had kept them alive all these years meant nothing, because the problems of keeping children alive are not real for children. The older children felt, with my father gone, that they could invite their friends to the house without fear that their friends would be insulted, or, as had happened sometimes with me, being told that their friends were in league with the devil and intended to rob our family of everything we owned. I didn't fail to wonder, and it made me hate him, what on earth we owned that anyone else would want. His illness was beyond all hope of healing before anyone realized that he was ill. He had always been so strange and had lived like a prophet in such unimaginably close communion with the Lord that his long silences, which were punctuated by moans and hallelujahs and snatches of old songs while he sat at the living room window, never seemed odd to us. It was not until he refused to eat because, he said, his family was trying to poison him, that my mother was forced to accept as a fact what had until then been only an unwilling suspicion. When he was committed, it was discovered that he had tuberculosis, and as it turned out, the disease of his mind allowed the disease of his body to destroy him. But the doctors could not force him to eat either, and though he was fed intravenously, it was clear from the beginning that there was no hope for him. In my mind's eye, I could see him sitting at the window, locked up in his terrors, hating and fearing every living soul, including his children who had betrayed him too, by reaching toward the world which had despised him. There were 9 of us. I began to wonder what it could have felt like for a man to have had 9 children whom he could barely feed. He used to make little jokes about our poverty, which never, of course, seemed very funny to us. They could not have seemed very funny to him either, or else our all too feeble response to them would never have caused such rages. He spent great energy and achieved to our chagrin no small amount of success in keeping us away from the people who surrounded us. People who had all-night rent parties to which we listened when we should have been sleeping. People who cursed and drank and flashed razor blades on Lenox Avenue. He could not understand why, if they had so much energy to spare, they could not use it to make their lives better. He treated almost everybody on our block with the most uncharitable asperity, and neither they nor, of course, their children were slow to reciprocate. The only white people who came to our house were welfare workers and bill collectors. It was almost always my mother who dealt with them, for my father's temper, which was at the mercy of his pride, was never to be trusted. It was clear that he felt their very presence in his home to be a violation. This was conveyed by his carriage, almost ludicrously stiff, and by his voice, harsh and vindictively polite. When I was around 9 or 10, I wrote a play which was directed by a young white school teacher, a woman who then took an interest in me and gave me books to read, and in order to corroborate my theatrical bent, decided to take me to see what she somewhat tactlessly referred to as real plays. Theater going was forbidden in our house, but with the really cruel intuitiveness of a child, I suspected that the color of this woman's skin would carry the day for me. When at school she suggested taking me to the theater, I did not, as I might have done if she had been a Negro, find a way of discouraging her, but agreed that she should pick me up at my house one evening. I then, very cleverly, left all the rest to my mother, who suggested to my father, as I knew she would, that it would not be very nice to let such a kind woman make the trip for nothing. Also, since it was a school teacher, I imagine that my mother countered the idea of sin with the idea of education, which word, even with my father, carried a kind of bitter weight. Before the teacher came, my father took me aside to ask why she was coming, what interest she could possibly have in our house in a boy like me. I said I didn't know, but I too suggested that it had something to do with education. And I understood that my father was waiting for me to say something. I didn't quite know what. Perhaps that I wanted his protection against this teacher and her education. I said none of these things, and the teacher came and we went out. It was clear during the brief interview in our living room that my father was agreeing very much against his will and that he would have refused permission if he had dared. The fact that he did not dare caused me to despise him. I had no way of knowing that he was that he was facing in that living room a wholly unprecedented and frightening situation. Later, when my father had been laid off from his job, this woman became very important to us. She was really a very sweet and generous woman and went to a great deal of trouble to be of help to us, particularly during one awful winter. My mother called her by the highest name she knew. She said she was a Christian. My father could scarcely disagree, but during the 4 or 5 years of our relatively close association, he never trusted her and was always trying to surprise in her open Midwestern face the genuine, cunningly hidden and hideous motivation. In later years, particularly when it began to be clear that this education of mine was going to lead me to perdition, he became more explicit and warned me that my white friends in high school were not really my friends, and that I would see when I was older how white people would do anything to keep a Negro down. Some of them could be nice, he admitted, but none of them were to be trusted, and most of them were not even nice. The best thing was to have as little to do with them as possible. I did not feel this way, and I was certain in my innocence that I never would. But the year which preceded my father's death had made a great change in my life. I had been living in New Jersey, working in defense plants, working and living among Southerners, black and white. I knew about the South, of course, and about how Southerners treated Negroes and how they expected them to behave, but it had never entered my mind that anyone would look at me and expect me to behave that way. I learned in New Jersey that to be a Negro meant precisely that one was never looked at, but was simply at the mercy of the reflexes of the color of one's skin that the color of one's skin caused in other people. I acted in New Jersey as I had always acted, that is, as though I thought a great deal of myself. I had to act that way with results that were simply unbelievable. I had scarcely arrived before I earned the enmity, which was extraordinarily ingenious, of all my superiors and nearly all my co-workers. And beginning to make matters worse, I simply did not know what was happening. I did not know what I had done, and I shortly began to wonder what anyone could possibly do to bring about such animus, active, and unbearably vocal hostility. I knew about Jim Crow, but I had never experienced it. I went to the same self-service restaurant 3 times, and I stood with all the Princeton boys before the counter, waiting for a hamburger and coffee. It was always an extraordinarily long time before anything was set before me, but it was not until the 4th visit that I learned that, in fact, nothing had ever been set before me. I had simply picked something up. Negroes were not served there, I was told, and they had been waiting for me to realize that I was always the only Negro present. Once I was told this, I determined to go there all the time. But now they were ready for me, and though some dreadful scenes were subsequently enacted in that restaurant, I never ate there again. It was the same story all over New Jersey, in bars, bowling alleys, diners, places to live. I was always being forced to leave, silently or with mutual imprecations. I very shortly became notorious, and children giggled behind me when I passed, and their elders whispered or shouted. They really believed that I was mad. And it did begin to work on my mind, of course. I began to be afraid to go anywhere, and to compensate for this, I went to places to which I really should not have gone, and where, God knows, I had no desire to be. My reputation in town naturally enhanced my reputation at work, and my working day became one long series of acrobatics designed to keep me out of trouble. I cannot say that these acrobatics succeeded. It began to seem that the machinery of the organization I worked for was turning over day and night, but with one aim, to eject me. I was fired once and contrived with the aid of a friend from New York to get back on the payroll. Was fired again and bounced back again. It took a while to fire me for the 3rd time, but the 3rd time took. There were no loopholes anywhere. There was not even any way of getting back inside the gates. That year in New Jersey lives in my mind as though it were the year during which, having an unsuspected predilection for it, I first contracted some dread chronic disease, the unfailing symptom of which is a kind of blind fever, a pounding in the skull and a fire in the bowels. Once this disease is contracted, one can never be really carefree again, for the fever, without an instant's warning, can recur at any moment. It can wreck more important things than race relations. There is not a Negro alive who does not have this rage in his blood. One has the choice merely of living with it consciously or surrendering to it. As for me, this fever has recurred in me and does and will until the day I die. My last night in New Jersey, a white friend from New York took me to the nearest town, Trenton, to go to the movies and have a few drinks. As it turned out, he also saved me from, at the very least, a violent whipping. Almost every detail of that night stands out very clearly in my memory. I even remember the name of the movie we saw because its title impressed me as being so patently ironical. It was a movie about the German occupation of France, starring Maureen O'Hara and Charles Lawton, and called This Land Is Mine. I remember the name of the diner we walked into when the movie ended. It was the American Diner. When we walked in, the counterman asked what we wanted, and I remember answering with the casual sharpness which had become my habit. We want a hamburger and a cup of coffee. What do you think we want? I do not know why, after a year of such rebuffs, I so completely failed to anticipate his answer, which was, of course, we don't serve Negroes here. Let's see. Oh, this reply failed to discompose me, at least for the moment. I made some sardonic comment about the name of the diner, and then we walked out into the streets. This was the time of what was called the brownout, when lights of all American cities were very dim. When we re-entered the streets, something happened to me which had the force of an optical illusion or a nightmare. The streets were very crowded and I was facing north. People were moving in every direction, but it seemed to me in that instant that all the people I could see, and many more than that, were moving toward me, against me, and that everyone was white. I remember how their faces gleamed, and I felt like a physical sensation, a click at the nape of my neck, as though some interior string connecting my head to my body had been cut. I began to walk. I heard my friend call after me, but I ignored him. Heaven only knows what was going on in his mind, but he had the good sense not to touch me. I don't know what would have happened if he had, and to keep me in sight. I don't know what was going on in my mind either. I certainly had no conscious plan. I wanted to do something to crush these white faces, which were crushing me. I walked for perhaps a block or two until I came to an enormous, glittering, and fashionable restaurant in which I knew not even the intercession of the Virgin would cause me to be served. I pushed through the doors and took the first vacant seat I saw at a table for two and waited. I do not know how long I waited, and I rather wonder until today what I possibly could have looked like. Whatever I looked like, I frightened the waitress who shortly appeared, and the moment she appeared, all of my fury flowed toward her. I hated her for her white face, for her great, astounded, frightened eyes. I felt that if she found a black man so frightening, I would make her fright even worthwhile. She did not ask me what I wanted, but repeated as though she had learned it somewhere, "We don't serve Negroes here." She did not say it with the blunt, derisive hostility to which I had grown so accustomed, but rather with a note of apology in her voice and fear. This made me colder and more murderous than ever. I felt that I had to do something with my hands. I wanted her to come close enough for me to get her neck between my hands. So I pretended not to have understood her, hoping to draw her closer, and she did step a very short step closer with her pencil poised incongruously over her pad and repeated the formula, "Don't serve Negroes here." Somehow, with the repetition of that phrase, which was already ringing in my head like 1,000 bells of a nightmare, I realized that she would never come any closer and that I would have to strike from a distance. There was nothing on the table but an ordinary water mug half full of water, and I picked this up and hurled it with all my strength at her. She ducked and it missed her and shattered against the mirror behind the bar. And with that sound, my frozen blood abruptly thawed. I returned from wherever I had been, and I saw for the first time the restaurant, the people with their mouths open already, as it seemed to me, rising as one man, and I realized what I had done and where I was, and I was frightened. I rose and began running for the door. A round, pot-bellied man grabbed me by the nape of the neck just as I reached the doors and began to beat me about the face. I kicked him and got loose and ran into the streets. My friend whispered, "Run," and I ran. My friend stayed outside the restaurant long enough to misdirect my pursuers and the police, who arrived, he told me, at once. I do not know what I said to him when he came to my room that night. I could not have said much. I felt in the oddest, most awful way that I had somehow betrayed him. I lived it over and over and over again, the way one relives an automobile accident after it has happened and one finds oneself alone and safe. I could not get over two facts, both equally difficult for the imagination to grasp, and one was that I could have been murdered. But the other was that I had been ready to commit murder. I saw nothing very clearly, but I did see this, that my life, my real life, was in danger, and not from anything other people might do, but from the hatred I carried in my own heart. I had returned home around the second week in June in great haste because it seemed that my father's death and my mother's confinement were both but a matter of hours. In the case of my mother, it was clear that she simply had made a miscalculation. This had always been her tendency, and I don't believe that a single one of us arrived in the world or has arrived anywhere else since on time. But none of us dawdled so intolerably about the business of being born as did my baby sister. We sometimes amused ourselves during those endless stifling weeks by picturing the baby sitting within the safe, warm, dark, bitterly regretting the necessity of becoming a part of our chaos and stubbornly putting it off as long as possible. I understood her perfectly and congratulated her on showing such good sense so soon. Death, however, sat as purposefully at my father's bedside as life stirred within my mother's womb, and it was harder to understand why he lingered in that long shadow. It seemed that he had bent, and for a long time, all of his energies toward dying. Now death was ready for him, but my father held back. All of Harlem, indeed, it seemed to be infected by waiting. I had never before known it to be so violently still. Racial tensions throughout this country were exacerbated during the early years of the war, partly because the labor market brought together hundreds of thousands of ill-prepared people, and partly because Negro soldiers, regardless of where they were born, received their military training in the South. What happened in defense plants and army camps had repercussions, naturally, in every Negro ghetto. The situation in Harlem had grown bad enough for clergymen, policemen, educators, politicians, and social workers to assert in one breath that there was no crime wave, and to offer in the very next breath suggestions as to how to combat it. These suggestions always seemed to involve playgrounds, despite the fact that racial skirmishes were occurring in the playgrounds too. Playground or not, crime wave or not, the Harlem police force had been augmented in March, and the unrest grew, perhaps in fact partly as a result of the ghetto's instinctive hatred of policemen. Perhaps the most revealing news item out of the steady parade reports of muggings, stabbings, shootings, assaults, gang wars, and accusations of police brutality is the item concerning 6 Negro girls who sat upon a white girl in the subway because, as they all too accurately put it, she was stepping on their toes. Indeed, she was, all over the nation. I had never before been so aware of policemen on foot, on horseback, on corners, everywhere, always 2 by 2. Nor had I ever been so aware of small knots of people. They were on stoops and on corners and in doorways, and what was striking about them, I think, was that they did not seem to be talking. Never when I passed these groups did the usual sound of a curse or a laugh ring out, and neither did there seem to be any hum of gossip. There was certainly, on the other hand, occurring between them communication extraordinarily intense. Another thing that was striking was the unexpected diversity of the people who made up these groups. Usually, for example, one would see a group of Sharpies standing on the street corner, jiving the passing chicks, or a group of older men, usually for some reason in the vicinity of a barber shop, discussing baseball scores or the numbers, or making rather chilling observations about women they had known. Women in a general way tended to be seen less often together unless they were church women or very young girls, or prostitutes met together for an unprofessional instant. But that summer I saw the strangest combinations. Large, respectable, churchly matrons standing on the stoops or the corners with their hair tied up, together with a girl in sleazy satin whose face bore the marks of gin and the razor, or heavy-set, abrupt, no-nonsense older men in company with the most disreputable and fanatical race men, or these same race men with the Sharpies, or the Sharpies with the churchly woman. Seventh-day Adventists and Methodists and spiritualists seemed to be hobnobbing with holy rollers, and they were all alike, entangled with the most flagrant disbelievers. Something heavy in their stance seemed to indicate that they had all incredibly seen a common vision, and on each face there seemed to be the same strange, bitter shadow. The churchly women and the matter-of-fact, no-nonsense men had children in the army. The sleazy girls they talked to had lovers there. The Sharpies and the race men had friends and brothers there. It would have demanded an unquestioning patriotism, happily as uncommon in this country as it is undesirable, for these people not to have been disturbed by the bitter letters they received, by the newspaper stories they read, not to have been enraged by the posters then found all over New York, which described the Japanese as yellow-bellied Japs. It was only the race men, to be sure, who spoke ceasingly of being revenged. How this vengeance was to be exacted was not clear, for the indignities and dangers suffered by Negro boys in uniform, but everybody felt a directionless, hopeless bitterness, as well as that panic, which can scarcely be suppressed when one knows that a human being one loves is beyond one's reach and in danger. This helplessness and this gnawing uneasiness does something at length to even the toughest mind. Perhaps the best way to sum all this up is to say that the people I knew felt mainly a peculiar kind of relief when they knew that their boys were being shipped out of the South to do battle overseas. It was perhaps like feeling that the most dangerous part of a dangerous journey had been passed, and that now, even if death should come, it would come with honor and without the complicity of their countrymen. Such a death would be, in short, a fact with which one could hope to live. It was on the 28th of July, which I believe was a Wednesday, that I visited my father for the first time during his illness and for the last time in his life. The moment I saw him, I knew I had put off this visit so long. I had told my mother that I did not want to see him because I hated him, but this was not true. It was only that I had hated him, and I wanted to hold on to this hatred. I did not want to look on him as a ruin. It was not a ruin I had hated. I imagine that one of the reasons people cling to their hates so stubbornly is because they sense, once the hate is gone, that they will be forced to deal with pain. We traveled out to him, the older sister and myself, to what seemed to be the very end of a very long island. It was hot and dusty, and we wrangled, my aunt and I, all the way out over the fact that I had recently begun to smoke, and as she said, to give myself airs. But I knew that she wrangled with me because she could not bear to face the fact of her brother's dying. Neither could I endure the reality of her despair, her unsated bafflement as to what had happened to her brother's life and her own. So we wrangled, and I smoked from time to time, and she fell into a heavy reverie. Covertly, I watched her face, which was the face of an old woman. It had fallen in, the eyes were sunken and lightless. Soon she would be dying too. In my childhood, it had not been so long ago, I had thought her beautiful. She had been quick-witted and quick-moving and very generous with all the children, and each of her visits had been an event. At one time, one of my brothers and myself had thought of running away to live with her. Now she could no longer produce out of her handbag some unexpected and yet familiar delight. She made me feel pity and revulsion and fear. It was awful to realize that she no longer caused me to feel affection. The closer we came to the hospital, the more querulous she became, and at the same time naturally grew more dependent on me. Between pity and guilt and fear, I began to feel that there was another me trapped in my skull, like a jack-in-the-box who might escape my control at any moment and fill the air with screaming. She began to cry the moment we entered the room, and she saw him lying there all shriveled and still, like a little black monkey. The great gleaming apparatus which fed him and would have compelled him to be still even if he had been able to move brought to mind not beneficence but torture. The tubes entering his arm made me think of pictures I had seen when a child of Gulliver tied down by the pygmies on that island. My aunt wept and wept. There was a whistling sound in my father's throat. Nothing was said. He could not speak. I wanted to take his hand to say something, but I do not know what I could have said, even if he had heard me. He was not really in that room with us. He had at last really embarked on his journey. And though my aunt told me that he said he was going to meet Jesus, I did not hear anything except that whistling in his throat. The doctor came back and we left into that unbearable train again and home. In the morning came the telegram saying that he was dead. Then the house was suddenly full of relatives, friends, hysteria, confusion, and I quickly left my mother and the children to the care of those impressive women who, in Negro communities at least, automatically appear at times of bereavement armed with lotions, proverbs, patience, and an ability to cook. I went downtown. By the time I returned later the same day, my mother had been carried to the hospital and the baby had been born. For my father's funeral, I had nothing black to wear, and this posed a nagging problem all day long. It was one of those problems, simple or impossible of solution, to which the mind insanely clings in order to avoid the mind's real trouble. I spent most of that day at the downtown apartment of a girl I knew, celebrating my birthday with whiskey and wondering what to wear that night. When planning a birthday celebration, one naturally does not expect that it will be up against competition from a funeral, and this girl had anticipated taking me out that night for a big dinner and a nightclub afterwards. Sometime during the course of that long day, we decided that we would go out anyway when my father's funeral service was over. I imagine I decided it since, as the funeral hour approached, it became clearer and clearer to me that I would not know what to do with myself when it was over. The girl, stifling her very lively concern as to the possible effects of the whiskey on one of my father's chief mourners, black shirt, concentrated on being conciliatory and practically helpful. She found a black shirt for me somewhere and ironed it and dressed in the darkest pants and jacket I owned, and slightly drunk, I made my way to my father's funeral. The chapel was full but not packed and very quiet. There were mainly my father's relatives and his children, and here and there I saw faces I had not seen since childhood, the faces of my father's one-time friends. They were very dark and solemn now, seeming somehow to suggest that they had known all along that something like this would happen. Chief among the mourners was my aunt, who had quarreled with my father all his life, by which I do not mean to suggest that her mourning was insincere or that she had not loved him. I suppose that she was one of the few people in the world who had, and their incessant quarreling proved the strength of the tie that bound them. The only other person in the world, as far as I knew, whose relationship to my father rivaled my aunt's in depth was my mother, who was not there. It seemed to me, of course, that it was a very long funeral, but it was, if anything, a rather shorter funeral than most. Nor, since there were no overwhelming, uncontrollable expressions of grief, could it be called, if I dare to use the word, successful. The minister who preached my father's funeral sermon was one of the few my father had still been seeing as he neared his end. He presented to us in his sermon a man whom none of us had ever seen, a man thoughtful, patient, and forbearing, a Christian inspiration to all who knew him, and a model for his children. And no doubt the children, in their disturbed and guilty stare, were almost ready to believe this. He had been remote enough to be anything, and anyway, the shock of the incontrovertible that it was really our father lying up there in that casket prepared the mind for anything. His sister moaned, and this grief-stricken moaning was taken as corroboration. The other faces held a dark and non-committal thoughtfulness. This was not the man they had known, but they had scarcely expected to be confronted with him. This was, in a sense, deeper than questions of fact. The man they had not known, and the man they had not known may have been the real one. The real man, whoever he had been, had suffered, and now he was dead. This was all that was sure and all that mattered now. Every man in the chapel hoped that when his hour came, he too would be eulogized, which is to say forgiven, and that all of his lapses, greeds, errors, and strayings from the truth would be invested with coherence and looked upon with charity. This was perhaps the last thing human beings could give each other, and it was what they demanded after all of the Lord. Only the Lord saw the midnight tears. Only he was present when one of his children, moaning and wringing hands, paced up and down the room. When one slapped one's child in anger, the recoil in the heart reverberated through heaven and became part of the pain of the universe. And when the children were hungry and sullen and distrustful, and one watched them daily grow wilder and further away and running headlong into danger, it was the Lord who knew what the charged heart endured at the strap was laid to the backside. The Lord alone knew what one would have said if one had, like the Lord, the gift of the living word. It was the Lord who knew of the impossibility every parent in that room faced, how to prepare the child for the day when the child would be despised, and how to create in the child, by what means, a stronger antidote to this poison than one had found for oneself. The avenues, side streets, bars, billiard halls, hospitals, police stations, and even the playgrounds of Harlem, not to mention the houses of corrections, the jails, and the morgue, testified to the potency of the poison, while remaining silent as to the efficacy of whatever antidote, irresistibly raising the question of whether or not such an antidote existed. Raising, which was worse, the question of whether or not an antidote was desirable. Maybe poison should be fought with poison. When these several schisms in the mind and with more terrors in the heart than could be named, it was better not to judge the man who had gone down under an impossible burden. It was better to remember, thou knowest this man's fall, but thou knowest not his wrestling. When the preacher talked and I watched the children, years of changing their diapers, scrubbing them, slapping them, taking them to school, and scolding them had had the perhaps inevitable result of making me love them, though I'm not sure that I knew this then. My mind was busily breaking out with a rash of disconnected impressions. Snatches of popular songs, indecent jokes, bits of books I had read, movie sequences, faces, voices, political issues. I thought I was going mad. All these impressions suspended, as it were, in the solution of the faint nausea produced in me by the heat and liquor. For a moment, I had the impression that my alcoholic breath, inefficiently disguised with chewing gum, filled the entire chapel. And then someone began singing one of my father's favorite songs, and abruptly I was with him, sitting on his knee in the hot, enormous, crowded church, which was the first church we attended. It was the Abyssinian Baptist Church on 138th Street. We had not gone there long. With this image, a host of others came. I had forgotten in the rage of my growing up how proud my father had been of me when I was little. Apparently, I had had a voice, and my father had liked to show me off before the members of the church. I had forgotten what he had looked like when he was pleased, but now I remember that he had always been grinning with pleasure when my solos ended. I even remembered certain expressions on his face when he teased my mother. Had he loved her? I would never know. And when had it all begun to change? For now it seemed that he had not always been cruel. I remembered being taken for a haircut and scraping my knee on the footrest of the barber's chair, and I remembered my father's face as he soothed my crying and applied the stinging iodine. And then I remembered our fights which have been of the worst possible kind because my technique had been silence. I remembered the one time in all of our life together when we really had spoken to one another. It was on a Sunday, and it must have been shortly before I left home. We were walking, just the two of us in our usual silence, to and from church. I was in high school and had been doing a lot of writing, and I was, at about this time, the editor of the high school magazine. But I had also been a young minister and had been preaching from the pulpit. Lately, I had been taking fewer engagements and preached as rarely as possible. It was said in the church quite truthfully that I was cooling off. My father asked me abruptly, "You'd rather write than preach, wouldn't you?" I was astounded at his question because it was a real question, and I answered yes. That was all we said. It was awful to remember that that was all we had ever said. The casket now was opened, and the mourners were being led up the aisle to look for the last time on the deceased. The assumption was that the family was too overcome with grief to be allowed to make this journey alone, and I watched while my aunt was led up to the casket and muffled in black and shaking, led back to her seat. I disapproved of forcing the children to look on their dead father, considering that the shock of death, or more truthfully, the shock of death as a reality, was already a little more than a child could bear. But my judgments in this matter had been overruled, and there they were, bewildered and frightened and very small, being led one by one to the casket. But there is also something very gallant about children at such moments. It had something to do with their silence and gravity and with the fact that one cannot help them. Their legs somehow seem exposed, so that it is at once incredible and terribly clear that their legs are all they have to hold them up. I had not wanted to go to the casket myself, and I certainly had not wished to be led there, but there was no way of avoiding either of these forms. One of the deacons led me up, and I looked on my father's face. I cannot say that it looked like him at all. His blackness had been equivocated by powder, and there was no suggestion in that casket of what his power had been or could have been. He was simply an old man dead, and it was hard to believe that he had ever given anyone either joy or pain. Yet his life filled that room. Further up the avenue, his wife was holding his newborn child. Life and death so close together, and love and hatred, and right and wrong, said something to me which I did not want to hear concerning man, concerning the life of man. After the funeral, while I was downtown desperately celebrating my birthday, a Negro soldier in the lobby of the Hotel Braddock got into a fight with a white policeman over a Negro girl. Negro girls, white policemen in or out of uniform, and Negro males in or out of uniform were part of the furniture of the lobby of the Hotel Braddock, and this was certainly not the first time that such an incident had occurred. It was destined, however, to receive an unprecedented publicity, for the fight between the policeman and the soldier ended with the shooting of the soldier. Rumor flowing immediately to the streets outside stated that the soldier had been shot in the back, an instantaneous and revealing invention, and that the soldier had died protecting a Negro woman. The facts were somewhat different. For example, the soldier had not been shot in the back and was not dead, and the girl seems to have been as dubious a symbol of womanhood as her white counterpart in Georgia usually is. But nobody was interested in the facts. They preferred the invention because this invention expressed and corroborated their hates and fears so perfectly. It is just as well to remember that people are always doing this. Perhaps many of those legends, including Christianity, to which the world clings, began their conquest of the world with just some of such concerted surrender to distortion. The effect in Harlem of this particular legend was like the effect of a lit match in a tin of gasoline. The mob gathered before the doors of the Hotel Braddock simply began to swell and to spread in every direction, and Harlem exploded. The mob did not cross the ghetto lines. It would have been easy, for example, to have gone over Morningside Park on the west side, or to have crossed the Grand Central Railroad tracks at 125th Street on the east side to wreak havoc in the white neighborhoods. The mob seems to have mainly been interested in something more potent and real than the white face, that is, in white power. And the principal damage done during the riot of the summer of 1943 was to white business establishments in Harlem. It might have been a far bloodier story, of course, if at the hour the riot began, the establishments had still been open. From the Hotel Braddock, the mob fanned out east and west along 125th Street and for the entire length of Lenox, 7th, and 8th Avenues. Along each of these avenues and along each major side street, 116th, 125th, 135th, and so on, bars, stores, pawn shops, restaurants, even little luncheonettes had been smashed open and entered and looted. Looted, it might be added, with more haste than efficiency. The shelves really looked as though a bomb had struck them. Cans of beans and soup and dog food, along with toilet paper, cornflakes, sardines, and milk tumbled every which way. And abandoned cash registers and cases of beer leaned crazily out of the splintered windows and were strewn along the avenues. Sheets, blankets, and clothing of every description formed a kind of path as though people had dropped them while running. I truly had not realized that Harlem had so many stores until I saw them all smashed open. The first time the word wealth ever entered my mind in relation to Harlem was when I saw it scattered on the streets. But one's first incongruous impression of plenty was countered immediately by an impression of waste. None of this was doing anybody any good. It would have been better to have left the plate glass as it had been and the goods lying in the store. It would have been better, but it would also have been intolerable for Harlem had needed something to smash. To smash something is the ghetto's chronic need. Most of the time, it is the members of the ghetto who smash each other and themselves. But as long as the ghetto walls are standing, there will always come a moment when those outlets do not work. That summer, for example, was not enough to get into a fight on Lenox Avenue or curse out one's cronies in the barbershops. If ever, indeed, the violence which fills Harlem's churches, pool halls, and bars erupts outward in a more direct fashion, Harlem and its citizens are likely to vanish in an apocalyptic flood. This is not likely to happen is due to a great many reasons, most hidden and powerful among them, the Negro's real relation to the white American. This relation prohibits simply anything as uncomplicated and satisfactory as pure hatred. In order really to hate white people, one has to blot out so much out of the mind and the heart that this hatred itself becomes an exhausting and self-destructive pose. But this does not mean, on the other hand, that love comes easily. The white world is too powerful, too complacent, too ready with gratuitous humiliation, and above all, too ignorant and too innocent for that. One is absolutely forced to make perpetual qualifications, and one's own reactions are always canceling each other's out. It is this, really, which has driven so many people mad, both white and black. One is always in the position of having to decide between amputation and gangrene. Amputation is swift, but time may prove that the amputation was not necessary, or one may delay the amputation too long. Gangrene is slow, but it is impossible to be sure that one is reading one's symptoms right. The idea of going through life as a cripple is more than one can bear, and equally unbearable is the risk of swelling up slowly in agony with poison. And the trouble finally is that the risks are real, even if the choices do not exist. But as for me and my house, my father had said, we will serve the Lord. I wonder, as we drove him to his resting place, what this line had meant for him. I had heard him preach it many times. I had preached it once myself, proudly giving it an interpretation different from my father's. Now the whole thing came back to me as though my father and I were on our way to Sunday school and I were memorizing the golden text. And if it seems evil unto you to serve the Lord, choose you this day whom you will serve, whether the gods which your fathers served that were on the other side of the flood, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land ye dwell. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. I suspected in those familiar lines a meaning which had never been there for me before. All of my father's texts and songs, which I had decided were meaningless, were arranged before me at his death like empty bottles, waiting to hold the meaning which life would give them for me. This was his legacy. Nothing has ever escaped. The bleakly memorable morning, I hated the unbelievable streets and the Negroes and the whites who had equally made them that way. But I knew that it was folly, as my father would have said. This bitterness was folly. It was necessary to hold on to the things that mattered. The dead man mattered. The new life mattered. Blackness and whiteness did not matter. To believe that they did was an acquiescence in one's own destruction. Hatred, which could destroy so much, never failed to destroy the man who hated, and this was an immutable law. It began to seem that one would have to hold in the mind forever two ideas which seemed to be in opposition. The first idea was acceptance. The acceptance totally without rancor of life as it is, and men as they are. In the light of this idea, it goes without saying that justice is a commonplace. But this did not mean that one could be complacent, for the second idea was of equal power, that one must never in one's own life accept these injustices as commonplace, but must fight them with all one's strength. This fight begins, however, in the heart, and it now has been laid to my charge to keep my own heart free of hatred and despair. This intimation made my heart heavy, and now that my father was irrecoverable, I wished that he had been beside me so that I could have searched his face for the answers which only the future would give me now. So I wonder what responses, comments, reactions people have to any part of the reading.
Lois, it'll just take a minute because Donna's going to unmute everybody.
Okay.
So what we'd like people to do is just answer randomly. We're not going to do raise your hand or the chat. So, Lois, do you want to? I think the mics are coming off.
Okay.
Do you want to repeat the question?
So I was just asking for general response, but we could actually begin to think about, how these incidents, what relevance they have to what has happened in the past month here in the United States and across the world. Were there any new understandings that came out of his own thoughtful revelations that could help us understand what the issues are at the heart?
I think it's so relevant to what's happening today, and it's a way to look inside what a person really feels, what people really feel when they are treated as invisible or less.
And not allowed, right? And not allowed.
Right.
Here. Yeah. Oh boy.
Imagine that it was so many years ago and it's still the same.
I had a chance to meet James Baldwin after he left the United States.
Wow.
Went to the Riviera, and I met him in a coffee shop, and him and I had a conversation. And one of the things that he looked at me, and he looked at me as the new Afro-American, and that Afro-American now are growing up, want to be educated, want to be influenced, want to have money, and want to have status. The only thing that is going to be different in him is the white man is the color of skin. And he told me at that particular time, him and I discussed this because I didn't have any knowledge of any other Afro-American or any other black person, because the only thing that we had in common was the color of skin. And he said, as long as we live in America, that will be too separated, the color of skin, and you will never be looked at in America equal on a certain level. So we had a nice conversation about that, and looking today in our society and look at the Afro-Americans today, the things that they have accomplished and the things that they have participated in, and they're still looked at as the individual that is not equal. And I think that is something that is very important that we have to look at.
You have to realize that people are holding inside a resentment because of the supremacy.
Yes.
Exists. I mean, you have to resent that every day, that you have to prove yourself that you're equal.
Victoria, are you getting ready to say something? I see you moving towards the mic.
No.
Yeah. Okay. All right.
No, I guess one thing that struck me though was the description of the looting. It's just like what happened here on Rittenhouse Square. And I was horrified when I saw it on the TV news cameras with no police at all, and it's just exactly the same. And I was present in Baltimore when the looting started after the shooting of Dr. Martin Luther King, and I actually saw it begin. I was waiting at a bus stop right after having gone to a movie. We'd seen Elvira Madigan. I was a graduate student there, and we saw a group of black teenage men come running across the street. They smashed the window of a shoe store and they grabbed what they could. And then in hot pursuit came a clutch of policemen dressed as I'd never seen police before, with
Riot gear.
Full riot gear, helmets and face shields and batons and bulletproof vests and holding up shields like, medieval warriors. And in pursuit of the young men. And it just all happened in a flash. And my date and I went back to our dorm at Johns Hopkins on the bus, and we were living in an old building from the 1920s where F. Scott Fitzgerald had lived when his wife was institutionalized. And then Johns Hopkins had bought a couple of these buildings, very nice old apartment buildings, and turned them into graduate school dormitories. And for the next few nights, we went up on the roof and we watched Baltimore burn. And there were National Guard patrolling in the streets in tanks, like enormous slugs going by below us. And I'm sure, you know, that many of us have memories of that sort. But it all, in that event in '68, it was black on black violence. They destroyed their ghettos and white stores in the ghettos. So
Right.
they didn't come into neighborhoods like as they did in this past month. I think it's a fascinating reading. I've read some of Baldwin. I think he just writes so beautifully. And I like the movie very much. If anyone hasn't seen it, I Am Not Your Negro. I highly recommend it. It's probably available on Amazon, Netflix. To be able to see things from inside his mind, which I think the protests on the streets have been trying to bring out, but he gives such articulate voice to those feelings. The protests are symbolic. They cannot express things as he does. He had a real gift for that, and I think that it continues to be highly relevant.
19-year-old to have that kind of insight. Amazing for a 19-year-old. I know he was writing in retrospect, but still, had to be aware of those things and be able to give voice to it, which is, you don't usually think of 19-year-olds being so aware and articulate, but he was able to.
It's both very particular to the Negro situation, but it's universal in that it's describing a parent's death.
Yeah, for sure.
So it resonates on a rich arc of registers.
The one line
Very
he said
beautiful.
about that Harlem needed to smash something.
Right.
And it made me understand more because when I see people smash windows, I think, what are you doing? It's not helping anybody. And he said that too. It really isn't doing anybody any good.
But there was
needed to smash something.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, it does feel good, doesn't it, when you even kill a fly or something? It feels
I
good.
guess so. I always thought it was testosterone. When men get angry, they smash something, you know. Usually something that they own. But
Lois,
just anger, pent up anger and
Who's trying to speak? I'm sorry. Who is it? Lynn? Okay.
Michelle Brogan. Lois, thank you. This was so brilliant. I did happen to see the interview with James Baldwin as well, but this was just amazing. And to think that it was 77 years ago, and it could have been, I mean, he could be on CNN today talking about, and capitalized all of it, exactly what's going on. But what really struck me was how he understood how destructive hatred is. That it just eats you up like his father. And that unfortunately, you don't realize until it's too late that this person was another person. They weren't always that way.
Right. Yeah.
But thank you. I really, really enjoyed it.
It's an excellent writing. Brilliant.
Yeah. I had forgotten, you know, there's been a lot of recent things in the newspaper of older men from the World War II, people who fought in World War II, Black men who are finally getting recognized and getting some of the medals that they deserved, which had not been done before. And I don't think that I remembered realizing that they were all sent to camps in the South to get their training, which I can understand, which in 1940, this probably was still a very difficult time to be there. And so the hatred of what, people feeling superior and, taking it out on this group, for the parents to see, thank God they got out of that training camp. Now they can go to war, as though that's an easier thing. It was just so poignant to really think. It made it very real what people were experiencing.
Yeah, that's very insightful.
I also had, I thought about this a lot when the things were happening here in Philadelphia. 2 blocks from my house, the stores were being smashed and store windows were being smashed and looting was being taken place, but stuff was also strewn on the street from what I could see. The same kind of thing happens. But in 1968, I was a public health nurse in Washington, D.C. at the time, and I did not realize it when I left for work early in the morning that the riots had started. And it was on 14th Street Northwest, which is the street I had to drive on to get to my workspace, and then from there to an elementary school that I was assigned to for that day. So I drove through the riots. I drove through the cars burning, the smashing, everything happening. Cars were being shaken on the street as we were trying to drive by. And I was 7 months pregnant at the time, so I was really kind of scared, being in that situation. But anyway, I got there. The thing that was two upsetting things. One was that the children in my school, my elementary school, we had to safely evacuate them from the school because it was still coming up that street. But many of their homes were already on fire on Georgia Avenue. So finding the parents and finding a safe place for these kids to go to, it was just so upsetting and, terrible. And then when I needed to go home, everyone advised me not to go back down 14th Street, which was probably a good idea because I had to go to Northern Virginia. So I went north, got on the Beltway, went around the Beltway to my home, stopped at a grocery store on the way because I needed milk or something. I walk in the grocery store and there's like that piped music playing in, over everything. People were going about their business as though not all hell was breaking loose, 10 miles from there, and things were being changed forever. Nobody was aware, not one soul was aware of what was going on. It was so incongruous. And that's how I felt that day here, because on my street, people were walking their dogs, they were wheeling children in strollers, they were running, riding their bikes, as though it was normal, and so that kind of thing, it was just striking to me, and it made me go back to remember that experience in 68 and thinking, gosh, that's 52 years ago. What has changed? Why are we still having these kinds of incidents throughout the country? And then my daughter led me to this particular essay of Baldwin, which I think was so instructive, and it struck me because it is the year I was born. I'm like, oh my God, my whole life this stuff has been going on and it still isn't fixed, so we have so much to be doing in terms of institutional racism and trying to undo that. And it's few things are happening, but not fast enough, I would say. The one thing that struck me in reading something here was the issue of tearing down all the statues. There was something towards the end of this essay that made me think about fixing things fast. They just want to change it immediately, and then discover that maybe wasn't the right thing. I think the issue of these statues is an interesting one because some people are saying, use it as a teachable moment. The one of Lincoln with the former slave kneeling or partially kneeling can be interpreted a lot of different ways. And when you hear what Lincoln said to the person, you must not kneel, you are a free man, or whatever. You don't get that from just looking at the statue, but people want to throw it away without somehow having it be a statue to the value of the person. And I don't know if some of those we need to rethink or not, if there are other ways of having the history preserved. But I really did like better what we did at the site of the where the Liberty Bell is, you know, exposing the slave quarters that Washington had and telling a beautiful story about them so that people could really understand what had happened there. That was a long time ago, right? 10 or 15
Yeah.
years.
Well,
That was
history. Good.
history. Yeah, yeah, that part was useful. So I don't know what people think about that, but
Well,
There was
I regret that the cherry tree thing was a fable. Other than that, I still hang on to that. But basically, we need real history, and we certainly don't have it in the schools at all.
absolutely.
Yeah, I would love to jump in. I'm Emily. I'm an intern for Penn's Village. I don't know if everyone knows me. I've been working with Kristen and Harriet, and I actually emailed Lois the other day. But I just wanted to jump in basically because this is obviously like, I'm only 20, so this is my first experience kind of dealing with all of this. But growing up in Center City, I've been going to protests since I was 14. And I think my generation has been doing a lot. Like, I think we've, you know, made it our mission to uproot kind of all of these problems. And in the reading, he had to learn a lot from his dad, and he didn't really understand what he was saying, where, you know, you can't trust like white people, they're going to try and tear you down. And I think it's also like we as a generation have been trying to interpret what was left before us and then change it. Because there's so much underneath that people don't realize. Kids my own age, definitely not from Philadelphia, didn't have the same exposure that I did to gentrification, poverty, unequal education, gun violence, things like that are perpetually, you know, promoted to keep the Black community down. So I think it's really interesting that that's a correlation, and that I'm really happy that my generation has kind of made it its mission to lead these protests and be the generation that tries to actually fix things, even though there's still a long way to go. So it's been really, really amazing for me to be so young and have everyone around me be so involved and passionate about really changing the entire infrastructure.
We're counting on you guys. We're counting on you guys. You're our hope.
You feel the burden on your shoulders?
Yeah, I think everyone my age does. I think like it's even on social media, like if you're not posting, if you're not spreading information on Instagram, like people are calling you out. Like if you're not doing your part to even, you know, spread awareness, then people are calling you out. And the new normal is, you know, activism and doing your part. There's no like going back. There's no like.
And the social, the internet, etc., has changed everything. Like there's no excuse to be in a bubble anymore.
Right.
Bubbles have to go.
This is Mark Raymond. I have a question for Mr. Bailey. When you were having discussions with James Baldwin, did you get a sense that he was that there was hope or optimism, or that he was disillusioned that things didn't turn out quite the way he thought they should?
Well, I think my feeling was that it was the timing that the incident happened to him, because the incident that happened to him at that particular time was everything that he was saying was true. But in my generation, I had to look at things different because I didn't go to that type of racial incident, but I learned a lot from it. But at the end, he gave me one advice, that long as you are American Black, there will always be a gap between you and the American white man. That was one of the things that he said. It's like, don't care whatever it is, you will never feel comfortable with them to a certain extent.
You know, it's a lack of trust, but just really fear.
Yes.
And rightfully so.
And
Rightfully so, right?
Unfortunately.
Yeah.
I'd like to respond to Emily. I would compare what you said and are feeling with what my generation felt when we went and marched against the war in Vietnam. And we really changed history, those protests against the war. They brought down a president. They laid bare the lies that the administration had been telling us. And I think this is the first time that we've seen a mass movement of comparable
Yes.
commitment and power. And my one, and I think it's that your generation is changing history, and of course a lot of older people are joining in the protest. But my one concern is that we do have to keep our sense of historical depth. And coming back to the question of the statues, there was a wonderful editorial in the New York Times in recent days, whose author I've forgotten, but he said his criterion for keeping a statue would be, did that person contribute to a more perfect union, quoting one of our founding documents. And clearly the Confederate war generals did not. And it's ironic that some of the forts in the South that were named after them were not named until World War II. And that says something about the environment that the black recruits in basic training would have found, that Baldwin alludes to.
Yeah.
But this editorialist in the New York Times was saying, we know that Washington kept slaves, and so did Andrew Jackson, but they also made tremendous contributions. So I thought the idea of whether a person contributed to a more perfect union or not was a provocative and, to me, appealing standard by which to decide, and not just to go in. On Washington Square, our statue of George Washington was defaced, and it was spray painted with black spray paint. He committed genocide, and then in bright pink letters, AP, AB, all police are bastards, and gestures like that. I just can't approve of. I understand that they reflect anger in a moment, but I hope that people will begin to reflect more calmly, and we won't continue to see so much of that kind of destruction, mindless destruction, I think.
I thank you for sharing that, Victoria. One of the things that I think is so important is how to harness the energy that's in all of this anger, rage, and disbelief, and whatever is going on as people are coming to grips with all of this, because the kind of change that needs to take place cannot happen overnight. It is work that has to go on. Changing laws, changing institutions, all of that stuff. And little by little, we've chipped away at some of it. But, the other groups in the country, the Native Americans and, other immigrant groups now are, facing similar things. But of course, the largest group and the one been debased the longest since we ever got formed is the group we call African Americans. Interesting to discover that race is really not a real thing. We're all almost exactly alike. So, it's something that got invented by us here as a way of keeping a group for free labor. So, that's been the history of all of it. And it's
worldwide.
And it's worldwide. And, but we really can, I believe that we can, hopefully, before I kick the bucket, we could see some major changes, and the energy that the young people are putting forward. And then we have a lot of really smart people, some in this audience here, that can recommend some kinds of changes, that small and big, that I think could really begin to make a difference. But just awareness, and these kind of readings to me are really useful in helping just put it into my head and heart. Oh my gosh, this is the kind of stuff we're talking about, and this is what it's like for people.
Lois, I wanted to comment on something you said earlier about young people.
Yeah.
Let us not forget that there isn't a black family in this country that don't have the talk with their sons, and who live with this anger and frustration from the day they're old enough to understand what their dad is telling them.
Yeah.
I think it's going to be a long time before that goes away, but we need
Absolutely.
to never forget
Yeah.
that it's,
Needed.
their children are dealing with this
Yeah.
very young.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Our kids probably not till much later.
Well, prejudice isn't just racial. I made my career as an Italianist, a professor of Italian culture, and there's tremendous prejudice in Italy of Northern Italians towards Southern Italians. The Southern Italians are the Negroes of Italy.
Mhm.
And there are countries like North and South Vietnam where modern political boundaries uh, may not coincide with ancient enmities, that within the same country and the same race, there can be one group against another. It's in Africa too. So it's a human problem. It's not just unique to our era and the heritage, or if you want, that's not a good word, but the sad legacy of slavery. There was slavery in antiquity too, and in the Renaissance. The Christians took Turkish slaves, and the Turks captured Christian boats and made Christian slaves.
Let's face it, we're not very highly evolved yet.
Yeah,
We're pretty bad as human beings. That tribal feeling, it's hard to get rid of.
Yeah.
Yes, well, yeah, the sociologists have taught us a lot about that.
Yeah.
So thoughts about why it is so difficult to change all this, get systemic racism changed in our society. It's so infiltrated and embedded, but what can we do, even as a Penn's Village, what could we be doing that would help to raise awareness, begin to even tackle little things that could make a difference in our own community? I don't know if you have any thoughts about that.
It's kind of hard when you're on Zoom.
Seems to me that education is one place of many we could probably start. There's so much unequal quality and access to education throughout the country now, between public schools and private, and between public schools in rich areas versus poor areas. That if we could equalize the access and the quality of education across the country, I think that would help tremendously.
The Philadelphia school district is falling apart, and I think it's no coincidence that it's a very diverse area. I think because there are so many people that, students that aren't white, it doesn't get as much funding as other schools. And for me, going to like a university and coming out of Philadelphia, my school, we ran out of soap. We didn't have a music program. We didn't have a Spanish program. And I was fortunate in the district. So I absolutely saw that firsthand, that it's so unequal, the education that is given. But I also am lucky because Philadelphia School District is one of the first in the country that required you to take African American history. So my freshman year, that was my first history class in high school. And I think that is something that, everyone needs, because I feel like just being in that environment, also being with diverse classmates and having, class with just so many people from different parts of the city, that also gave me a lot of exposure, but having that class was really necessary. So I agree with
It's so good to hear.
that.
It's so good to hear that. That's news today. I think that's wonderful.
Yeah.
Emily, did you find that students of color and white students were able to engage with one another? They began to feel safe exchanging ideas and thoughts, and
Absolutely. Yeah, I definitely think so. I think my school was also really good about that. We were project based. I went to Science Leadership Academy on 22nd and Arch, which is no longer at that location. but my school was actually 1/3 black, 1/3 white, and 1/3 like every like other race kind of. So they purposefully made it a very diverse environment, which I thought was really great. And I thought that made sure that no group felt especially marginalized.
Right.
And I know there was some people that came from, you know, all white or all black neighborhoods that weren't as comfortable, but definitely by the time we graduated, being in those classes, that was so important. And I don't think we had like any incidents that I was aware of at my school of any sort of racial prejudice. I'm sure there's incidents I'm not aware of, but from my school, I thought that was an amazing experience. And that wasn't even something I really registered because it was just so normal to me growing up in the city. Like, it's just so normal to me. And it was a like culture shock for me to go to a university, like I go to Pittsburgh, and to have kids that came from Philadelphia suburbs, all white schools. They had no idea that gentrification existed. They didn't understand where gun violence came from. They don't know about any of these problems that I'm exposed to because of my classmates and people around me. So I think that in itself is just...
They're very unfortunate to have that bubble, and you're very fortunate not to have had that bubble.
Yeah, absolutely.
Emily, how diverse was the teaching staff?
Let me think. I definitely would say that it was mostly white, but one of my English teachers was a black man, and he also led the slam poetry club, so he was an amazing mentor for a lot of the students. My other English teacher, she's Arab, and I don't really remember all my teachers, but I know it is still primarily white, which is an issue. And I know that that was something that my classmates had actually brought up, that they needed more teachers that, you know, looked like them. Right. And I think that's a huge issue too, because if you don't have those role models, that like, it's hard for you to feel like you belong or that's your place of learning. So I think, yeah, my school definitely had far more diverse teachers than a lot of other schools, but again, like even in my school, it needed to change, and that just shows the opportunities the disparity of opportunities that people have to even like pursue that type of thing.
Well, but if your education improves, then that should improve later, right? I mean, there should be more opportunities.
So Lois,
I was just going to say that, you know, we could maybe take a lesson from what Emily is suggesting and think about ways to make it possible to have dialogue in smaller groups, even among our members, with others who could help us begin to learn a lot of this stuff. I think might be really helpful, because we can't leave it all to the young people. We have to also understand it enough that we can at least share some resources to them and, you know, support to what they're going to be doing. So anyway, well, thank you all for listening and getting into the conversation. It's great.
Right. I want to thank you. And I don't know, some of you may know or may not know that there is a new book by Eddie Glaude Jr., who is the professor and chair of the Department of African American Studies at Princeton. And he is also, I don't remember the name, but he also has an endowed chair there at Princeton also. But he has a new book titled Begin Again, James Baldwin, America, and its urgent lessons for our own. So thank you, Lois, for a very timely.
Mark, can I just add one thing? If people are interested in Eddie Glaude, there is I think, a very good C-SPAN speech by him on C-SPAN. So,
yeah, I was going to ask you to share that. Could you share that link with maybe Mark, and he could send it out?
Sure.
Do you have anybody that attended here? Okay, because I think that's really well done, Janet. Thank you for sharing that.
Thank you. Yeah, we can get that done. Donna can send it out. So if you'll just send it to me, Janet, that'd be great.
Sure.
Well, thank you all very, very much for attending. And Lois, thank you very much for a lovely read and a wonderful.
Great.
Very timely.
Gracias, Marco. Hasta la próxima.
De nada. Bye-bye.
Bye.